Okay, so on the call today, we've got Harpreet Kaur from Electronics Watch. Harpreet is a human rights lawyer, and I looked her up on the internet today. She's a climate just solutions consultant. She works as the UK representative for Electronics Watch. Now, they focus on modern slavery, particularly in the electronics industry, but these principles can also be applied to other industries. So following on from Harpreet, we'll also hear from Peter from the University of Edinburgh, who's a procurement policy officer who works with Harpreet and also works on general procurement for the university. And he's going to give us some insights into how they've applied the Electronics Watch principles. So Harpreet, if you would like to share your presentation, I'm going to hand over to you.
Great, thank you very much, and thanks for having me today as well. Hopefully you can see my slide deck on screen now, and I'm assuming Claire will tell me if you can't. Great. So yes, I'm the UK representative of Electronics Watch. I've been working with Electronics Watch almost since its inception. And as Claire says, modern slavery is endemic in a number of industries, from food, construction, medical appliances, garments, but it's also an issue within the Electronics Watch industry. And I'll be talking through how the Electronics Watch model specifically looks to monitor risks of modern slavery, but also engage with members, manufacturers, industry representatives, and civil society monitors through what we call a worker-driven monitoring approach to investigate allegations, and where there's credible evidence of modern slavery, then to repair the harms that have occurred, but also work with industry representatives to prevent them from occurring in the future as well. And I'll be talking through two specific case studies. But before that, I'll kind of outline the Electronics Watch model in general. The other thing to say is that while this webinar focuses on modern slavery, the Electronics Watch approach to labour violations within the electronic supply chain is that the single best way to prevent modern slavery is to uphold good labour conditions, decent work conditions, living wages. And so while this webinar focuses on modern slavery, there's a kind of wider holistic approach to trying to protect concept of decent work throughout the electronic supply chain. And I'd be happy to answer questions about that as we go through. But starting with a kind of general overview of the Electronics Watch model, then it began with a very simple idea, and that is that public procurement, which is a large market in the global economy and accountable to the public, could and should be a force for promoting sustainable development and the protection of workers' human rights that make to organisations, a number of which are listed here on this slide, and they are affiliates to Electronics Watch, but we also collaborate with civil society monitors doing worker-driven monitoring on the ground in the electronic supply chain. And just a quick note of the importance of public procurement. It's been recognised by the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which specifically says that states should promote respect for human rights by business enterprises with which they conduct commercial transactions. That's UN Guiding Principle number 6. It's a component of several national action plans on business and human rights, including the UK. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, specifically 12.7, calls for sustainable public procurement. And of course, the EU Directive on Public Procurement also places social and environmental criteria on an equal footing with transparency, equal treatment, and non-discrimination as well. It's also recommended by the OECD and other organizations. and increasingly being taken seriously by public sector institutions. Electronics Watch has something like more than 300 affiliates now across 7 countries, with the combined purchasing power of approximately €1 billion in the electronics market through a variety of supply contracts, purchasing orders, and framework agreements as well. So how does it work in practice? If you can see my face on the kind of right-hand corner of your screen, you might want to move it to explore the content on this screen, but essentially Electronics Watch affiliates are public sector organisations. They're committed to socially responsible public procurement. A number of them, when it's practically possible to do so, will incorporate the Electronics Watch contract conditions within their ICT hardware contracts. These contracts require a number of different things. It requires effective and accountable due diligence to ensure that final assembly and component ICT factories comply with a specific labour code. And that labour code, as I alluded to in my opening, is quite holistic in its references to a number of ILO conventions. Once those due diligence conditions are in place and adherence to a code of conduct is in place, there are also a number of other contract requirements within the standard Electronics Watch contract terms. That is to allow Electronics Watch to monitor compliance through worker-driven monitoring, which we do through our civil society partners, and through accepted standards of due diligence and worker-driven monitoring as well. When breaches or potential breaches are found, we do work collaboratively with the industry and brands to try and seek reparation and commitment to specific preventative measures as well. So how does this model relate to the Modern Slavery Act? Well, the Home Office has guidance on transparency in the supply chain. It's guidance to Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act, and it talks about transparency, due diligence, monitoring and evaluation, remedy, and training. And all areas that Electronics Watch seeks to provide to its affiliates. So starting with transparency, the Electronics Watch contract terms require suppliers of its affiliates to identify factories and goods associated with final assembly components factories, disclose chemical inventories, disclose already existing factory compliance findings and corrective action plans, and trading conditions that might impact upon workers' human rights in supply chains. An innovative aspect of the Electronics Watch model is that this information can then be shared across all its public sector affiliates, which drives a kind of collaborative leveraging of information about the supply chain, which in our view is the very first step that's needed to try and secure improvements, but it's by no means the only thing that's required. The second element in the Home Office's guidance talks about due diligence, and I've already talked about the Electronics Watch contract conditions requiring due diligence to adhere to our labour code, which is quite expansive, and talk more about what's required specifically in relation to that in the Q&A if there are questions about that. But again, transparency, due diligence on their own are not enough. We also look to undertake monitoring and evaluation, and this is really where the Electronics Watch model is quite innovative in being able to get tangible improvements on factory floors. Our network of monitors are able to inspect factory premises, undertake reviews, factory personnel records and factory documents. And it's interesting that the Home Office guidance also refers to the need to hear from workers themselves when undertaking monitoring activities, and that's as well as having whistleblowing facilities, and that's something that Electronics Watch takes very seriously. Our monitors are based on the ground in high ICT producing countries like Czechia, China, Mexico, Indonesia, Malaysia, Nepal, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, etc., where a lot of the final assembly and components factories in the ICT supply chain are based. And our methodology really recognizes that for a lot of workers in these factories, speaking about their working conditions is taking a risk. So there's not a culture of asserting rights. There's a culture of fear and losing the income that you potentially losing the income that you need to sustain your families in very precarious work conditions. So one of the monitoring strategies of Electronics Watch is worker, which recognizes the importance of having secure and safe spaces that workers trust, and having off-site semi-structured interviews, which is very different to the auditing model, which has been found to really be quite limiting. As one example, in a different industry, you might recall the devastating impact of the Rana Plaza factory collapse, and that factory had been audited twice by two separate auditors in the weeks or months before the factory collapsed. And so the worker-driven approach within Electronics Watch, we feel, gives us access to the meaningful data that's required. Electronics Watch also hosts annual conferences, usually in December, and Peter was there. Some of your colleagues may have been there, and Peter, you may recall we had some representatives saying that, you know, for an auditor, they're literally given a template of how to respond to questions, and the questions may be in English. They may not understand what they're supposed to convey and the meaning of them. So that approach, the worker-driven approach, has been significant, and I'll talk about it in more detail in relation to two case studies. I'll talk more about Remedy as well in relation to those case studies, but also quickly on training. Electronics Watch does host webinars for its affiliates on how affiliates can help promote compliance with the contract conditions, which, as you can imagine, are quite onerous, and that's something we're looking to do. So the types of improvements this model have had include ending forced student labour in a factory in China. I'll talk about that. Secondly, addressing debt bondage, which is, according to the ILO, a form of modern slavery. And again, I'll talk more about that. But some of the examples that I won't talk about but are important to raise as impact include reinstating workers that were illegally fired for trying to form a union in a factory in the Philippines, improving work shift scheduling for workers in the Czech Republic, including workers that didn't know some days whether they'd have any work, other days they were suddenly told to kind of come in for very long shifts, and living in kind of accommodation near the factory that was far from appropriate. In an Indonesian factory, improving occupational health and safety, so using a less toxic cleaning solvent where previously a toxic solvent had been used, which had been linked to impact on the central nervous system, the skin, eyes, respiratory systems, liver, kidneys, but also having a risk to young women of childbearing age, resulting in birth defects and miscarriages. And also getting compensation for the worker of a family that committed suicide. I'll now talk about the Chinese forced student labour case in a little bit more detail. Through worker-driven surveys, dialogue, training, and affiliate engagement, as well as factory and brand engagement, Electronics Watch was able to secure important improvements in that case. And that case was about students who were doing a variety of different degrees. Some of them may have been doing an accountancy degree or a diploma, and they were told that they couldn't get their degrees unless they finished 10 to 12 hour a day shifts, 6 days a week, long night shifts, minimal breaks, in the ICT supply chain. Electronics Watch engaged in on-site worker surveys, worker-driven dialogue and training, and working with brands, factories and affiliates to get commitments from brands that they would implement stricter student intern policies to ensure that that labour could only take place with the consent of the students, and the degree wasn't conditional on undertaking that labour. And the UK higher education purchasing consortia that were involved in this were very helpful, ensuring that recommendations were kind of pushed through supplier engagement. A very recent case of remedy involves a factory in Thailand. In this case, what we saw was a lot of migrant workers from Myanmar alerting the Burmese Migrant Workers' Rights Network, MWRN, that a Thai factory was retaining their passports and other identity information. So MWRN, which is a civil society partner of Electronics Watch, engaged in worker-driven monitors and found that some people had been employed for months when in possession of their identity documents, which is a real curtailment of people's security, given that with there being migrants, they felt that their freedom to move had been limited by not having their right to work and be in Thailand in their possession. But they also found that a lot of the migrant workers had paid a considerable sum of money to have the opportunity to work, and had incurred debts of up to around $660 US, which is a significant amount for these workers. And the debt repayment was being taken out of their monthly salaries, as were deductions for food and housing. So these kinds of actions, recruitment fees, withholding of identity documents, etc., are risks, according to the ILO, of forced labour, debt bondage being a form of forced labour. And they were also prohibited by the brand's own standards that weren't being complied with, as well as local Thai law as well. So Electronics Watch engaged in a number of different engagements, again with the factory, the brands, engagement with the affiliates as well to secure compensation. Calcomp, which is the manufacturer in this case, supplying to tech giants like HP, is reimbursing at least 10,000 workers, making repayments which could total something like $10 million US, which is an estimate based on average sum of about $660 being paid to workers that had paid that sum to be able to have the privilege to work. And Electronics Watch remains in close contact with MWRN to try and ensure that workers that since left that factory can also be identified, because it's part of the reparation package that past workers that paid those fees, as well as existing workers, are compensated. And you can read more about those cases in a recent, December 2019 Reuters article, and also a document that Electronics Watch has created recently that's available on our website. And I understand that these slides will also be available to you, so you'll have those links. So this slide is really just an overview of hopefully what I have already described about the benefits of collaborating through the Electronics Watch model. And we anticipate that, through engagement in about 6 factories in the diversity of ways, toxic chemical exposure, decent work conditions, as well as debt bondage and forced labour, through engagement with at least 6 factories, Electronics Watch has directly improved the lives of 100,000 workers in the ICT supply chain. And that's really only possible with the leveraged collaboration of our over 300 affiliates that actively participate in trying to ensure that the contract clauses that they incorporate into their supplier contracts are adhered to in practice and allow Electronics Watch to undertake the monitoring and the remediation work that has been so successful. I'll pass on to Peter for now and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Hi, Harpreet. Thank you for that. That's really interesting and quite jarring, really, to kind of hear about that. Peter, I'm going to just put your presentation up for you, and then we will go straight into that. Just give me 1 second.
Okay.
Okay, can everyone see that?
I can.
Okay, I'll go with that then. I'll just go to your next slide. There you go. You can introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Peter Hayakawa. I'm the Procurement Policy Officer from the Procurement Office of the University of Edinburgh, and I've been working with Electronics Watch for a couple of years now. I've attended the last 2 conferences, which I highly recommend that people go to if they're affiliates of the organization. So I'm going to talk about a little bit, just for hopefully about 10 minutes, if I don't run over, about addressing modern slavery in higher education or further education. I should have put further education procurement as, and talking about the Electronics Watch model and how it fits into that with the kind of legal options we have in our regulations. So I'm going to talk about the measures that we have available. I'm going to talk some of the pitfalls and issues of dealing with that. I'm going to talk about what the University of Edinburgh does on this front, and I'm also going to talk about what I see are the benefits of the Electronics Watch model. So could we go to the next one, and I'll just go right into that. So first is Harpreet's kind of covered some of this, but I think modern slavery has been a big topic since the Modern Slavery Act was passed about 5 years ago now. And I think people need to know that there are 2 things about it. If they don't, which is modern slavery is systemic. It's an issue in almost every supply chain. It exists in some form or another in every country, including the United Kingdom. And it's particularly a problem in complex global supply chains that we as public buyers sit at the top of. The other thing about modern slavery is that it's a spectrum. So Harpreet mentioned debt bondage, and it's complex and it's a spectrum that goes from the worst, pure slavery in the modern world to forms of exploitative labor and everywhere in between, and it might be different in different iterations. And I think we'd all be concerned with exploitative conditions in general, whether they fit your definition of modern slavery or not. But as Harpreet said, kind of one of the leading authorities on this, the International Labor Organization, classes forms of exploitation that she's talking about that Electronics Watch is dealing with, like debt bondage, very similar to kind of things that were happening in the US and in Europe in the 19th century, like with coal workers or things who have to go in debt and only get paid in company store dollars and things like that. Oh, that's kind of the thing that Harpreet is talking about in that case. So I'm going to go through a couple of the measures that we have available to us in procurement regulations, which will be the same in the UK and Scottish regulations. The first is selection criteria in a procurement. So you can, the regs were changed in 2016. And with that change, we had kind of new powers to explicitly account for the International Labor Organization fundamental conventions as a form of international law to draw upon, as well as any relevant domestic law, including the Modern Slavery Act, to consider within the procurement. And the tool we have available to us is we can exclude suppliers that can't demonstrate adequately that they don't have a breach in this area. So you request compliance for those fundamental conventions, human trafficking laws. You can request compliance with the Modern Slavery Act, and the main thing there is the requirement for organizations with a turnover larger than 36 million pounds to produce a modern slavery statement and to share that with you if you request it. And you can exclude them if they haven't complied with that part of the Modern Slavery Act. Your ability, one thing that's in the rules, and this is something that's really underused, is you are allowed not only to exclude suppliers in the beginning stages of the procurement, you can also exclude them if you find a breach during the contract. And actually, this is when this would most likely happen anyway. But you're also able to request that any subcontractors of a supplier show that they're compliant with the International Labor Organization. And not enough people, I think, know this. So, and I think it's not explicit in the documentation you have available to you, which I think is a problem. And that's, the largest organizations at the top of the supply chain are not going to have a child labor or modern slavery violation in the top tier. It's subcontractors. So you can request that, and if a breach is disclosed, you can demand that the supplier replace that subcontractor if they'd like to keep the contract. So that's something you have to. The means that you do this is through something called the European Single Procurement Document. And it asks suppliers to confirm their compliance to the best of their knowledge with labor, social, and environmental law. And unfortunately, if you want to get more specific than that, like specific compliance with the Modern Slavery Act, you have to specifically mention that in your contract notice and your procurement documents. It's all based on self-reporting and supplier self-reporting, but you can exclude them from the process. So that was the bit. There's lots of other things that you have available. One underutilized thing is just engaging with your suppliers, whether they're current or prospective suppliers. And that's something that we really need to be focusing more on, particularly collaboratively. There's, of course, traditionally your award criteria, quality criteria that you can put in, and your specification, e.g., when appropriate, fair trade or equivalent requirements. And, probably the most promising area, and this is where Electronics Watch does most of its work, it's in contract management, contract terms, contract performance requirements. So I just have a comment about the value of someone's pointing out that some of the modern slavery statements that people have to produce, that you can exclude people if they don't produce. The content of the statements, they don't have to say anything. So you can produce a modern slavery statement, say you're a large organization, that says we do nothing to address modern slavery annually, and that's still compliant. So it's actually, I think the act has had a good positive impact, but it's much weaker than most people would like. Claire, can you go to the next slide? I'll try to hurry up because so this is just showing kind of the problem we have with the tools we have. The fact that labor law and international standards like the ILO are brought up in the procurement at all, I think is a positive sign. But you can see it's based on self-reporting. So here you said, has the bidder, this is in the European Single Procurement Document, which all 28 member states and for the time being, the England and Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland we use as well. Have you breached, to your knowledge, as a supplier, your obligations of field of labor law? You say, yep. So that's it. And you can exclude them from the contract if they don't. So it's kind of a blunt tool. Can you go to the next slide, Claire? Okay, so let's go through some of the issues that we have when we're dealing with modern slavery and our supply chains. I'll just rattle through them very quickly. One is global supply chains, as everyone knows, are extremely complex. And the topics related to modern slavery exploitative conditions are actually even more complex. So our supply chains for textiles or ICT equipment, they go through tons of countries. We don't have, they're underregulated. They're subject to different regulatory regimes at different parts of the supply chain. But all the topics, it's extraction of minerals, things that you wouldn't even think of. Like, I was unaware before I started engaging with of Electronics Watch about the issue of migrant workers. I was unaware of the issue of student workers actually being technically on internships, which are not really internships, which is work that Electronics Watch and its partners uncovered. Chemical safety in lots of and unsafe working conditions is another form of exploitative labor, and it's a hugely systemic issue in much of the world. And as a procurement person, I kind of lack expertise to set requirements. I do not have the ability to verify information provided to me by organizations when they're able to provide that organization. A great example would be chemicals. Government buying standards or green procurement guides from Europe do give you a list of chemicals. You can put that in your procurement. But if you provide that information saying this isn't available, if they say, yeah, we don't have that, or no, we don't, or they just provide a list of chemicals, I'm not a chemist, I can't verify that information. And it's the same thing. You say, well, you shouldn't produce cotton from Uzbekistan. If they provide a paper or something that says, yeah, don't worry, we've got it covered, there's not much you can do there. The other problem is that it's looking at labor rights is viewed as an externality. It's not a core consideration. And I think this is interesting. Procurement globally, public procurement, just not private procurement, counts for 2 trillion euros annually, and it accounts for 15 to 20% of global GDP. So it has a huge influence collectively on how the world works, how supply chains work. It's not inconsiderable, but each individual organization doesn't view our role at the top of the supply chain seriously. In fact, I believe we put too much pressure or too much responsibility. Not too much responsibility, I'd be hesitant to say that, but we don't give ourselves enough responsibility as the top of the supply chain. The brands kind of take all the heat. And maybe you'd say they don't take enough heat, but honestly, it's a systemic issue that we're dealing with, and we don't view it as a core issue. Our level of agency to deal with the issues is unclear to us, and our other pressures, mainly price competition, do create the conditions that make exploitative labor go forward. A great example would be high street fashion. Price competition, high street fashion creates a real race to the bottom situation in supply chains. We as public procurers have a lack of time to engage. We don't have time to review guidance. And even if we do set appropriate requirements, we do not have time to follow up with these on contract management. We're working on our own. I feel reinventing the wheel each time, even though we're engaging with the same companies. And the companies themselves would appreciate if public organizations didn't do a different thing every time. And that creates a lot of extra work for them if they have to do something completely different for each organization. Exclusion grounds are a blunt tool. Kicking out a subcontractor and cutting and run. I mean, this is a big reason why audits don't work. So Harpreet mentioned that social audits don't work partially because factory managers just hand a script in English to workers and tell them, when an human rights auditor comes, just hand them that script. That's one problem. But another problem is workers know that their livelihood's in question if they talk about the conditions that they're dealing with, because the only measure is to cut and run. The brand has a huge reputational risk, even though the conditions that created this, the global condition, are not always their fault. And if they stayed and tried to remediate the problem, actually that would be a bigger risk than just cutting and run. And likewise, our only measure in the selection grounds is to cut and run. It's not to remediate and actually compensate the workers for the problems or fix the problems even better that they're dealing with. And the last one, and this is really important, is a complete lack of transparency. So we're completely disconnected, I feel, from our own supply chains, and we have a complete lack of connection with the workers that produce our goods. So this is not all the issues, but that's some of the issues. So quickly, Claire, can you go to the next one? So here are some of the things that the University of Edinburgh has done on modern slavery in procurement. So we took a very proactive approach when we produced our own modern slavery statement. We didn't just write something, and obviously a lot of the focus is on our procurement and our supply chains, where most of these risks, or at least a lot of these risks, will lie. We integrated ILO Modern Slavery Act compliance below regulated levels. We introduced explicitly into our contract notices to suppliers, into our engagements with suppliers. We've also included it into our standard terms and conditions, into our non-regulated construction spend. And people may argue that these measures are weak, but we tried to make sure that covered as much of our spend as possible. And now it's even in our purchase order process. So even if someone doesn't go through the procurement office, there'll be some Modern Slavery Act checks of suppliers. We have a whole set of policies that we're working really hard to implement. Some that are longstanding, some that are new, on good food, fair trade and procurement, conflict minerals and procurement, palm oil. I think we're the first higher education organization to have conflict minerals policy, palm oil policy. Now, anyone can tell you that it's different to have a policy than a complete set of actions. Anyone who's looked into palm oil, it's a very complex issue. We work closely with EAUC, and EAUC provides a code of conduct and a program called Sustain that questions suppliers about these risks and develops action plans for them. We've engaged in supplier engagement. So these are all links. So if you set up, it gives you some information about some of the stuff we're doing. I'd be happy to talk with anybody about any of the other things we're doing. And one of the biggest things is affiliation with Electronics Watch. So let's go to the last slide and then we can wrap up, hopefully. Yeah, so I've wanted to relate the Electronics Watch, to wrap up the Electronics Watch model, to kind of what I saw as kind of the problems that we have. And those problems I mentioned earlier, I think kind of add up to ultimately the issue of addressing human rights or modern slavery through your procurement as too large of a problem to, one, deal with on your own, but also too large of a problems for even just public procurers to deal with, even if they dealt with collectively, because you need to have people with expertise on what the issues are, and it's a huge range of issues. The chemical safety alone is a very complex issue. You need also collective resource and for contract management engagement with suppliers. And so in the Electronics Watch model, buyers have expertise and knowledge from Electronics Watch staff, but also a network of researchers and monitors, and they produce reports on issues like suicide in factories, migrant workers, things like that you wouldn't ever realize on your own, and are frankly very underreported in the news. They have up-to-date tools that you can use, and mainly the terms and conditions, which allow us to work with the companies we're working with about disclosing factory locations in a way that hopefully is mutually beneficial, about working towards a common end with the brands that we're working with to deal with issues that are getting missed through standard human rights auditing processes. It facilitates collaboration with a whole range of organizations, including our fellow public buyers, but also with the researchers and worker representatives themselves. That worker voice that you get and worker representatives is really unique, and that's why the conference, the annual conference, where the monitors from places like Vietnam or Thailand and the researchers come and present their research, is really, really, really heartening. It really brings this issue alive, and it makes it real and less and more tangible. And that's one of the things I appreciate most about engagement with Electronics Watch and all its partners, is you get to talk to people who are actually dealing with issues in these places, including on kind of new frontiers, like, for instance, people doing work going to remote islands where they're mining nickel as a component for lithium batteries in Philippine islands, and or at the very bottom of the supply chain, mining rare minerals in Bolivia. That was at the last conference. That was a really interesting topic. The other thing that they produce, which was really key, is we rely entirely on self-reporting from suppliers themselves, and they actually have a huge incentive to not disclose anything because they can be kicked out of a procurement if they disclose a problem. But we know problems are just systemic, and you don't want to penalize a brand for being honest about problems that they're having. So it's a real catch-22. What the electronics watch process does is they have independent researchers that produce solid evidence based on standards, and they're trying to standardize that practice across all the monitoring partners that they can provide to brands to let them know, and to us to let us know what the problem is. And then if you have that evidence of a breach, then you can actually take action. And if you don't have that evidence of breach, you have the only thing you have to go on perhaps are international judgments, which are very rare, and news reports, which often are not solid enough for you to take action in your contract. So that evidence is core. And this last thing I'd mention is their focus on remediation. So instead of excluding a supplier, instead of shutting down a factory when a problem is solved, some cases of factories should be shut down. But in other cases, you want to protect people's livelihoods. You want to compensate the workers. And the cases that Harpreet mentioned, workers have actually been compensated. And I can't stress how rare these, in any, not just in ICT and electronics, which Electronics Watch focuses on, how rare this compensation of workers is. And the fact that public procurement had a role in that is really heartening. So the fact that they bring all those pieces together, I found very practical. So it's, I think we as an affiliate need to do much more to engage with the tools. We haven't solved the problem of how to deal. Electronics Watch has simplified their guidance and made it very practical, but it's still time consuming for us to deal with this and address that. And that's something we haven't completely gotten our heads around. But I think it's a very positive developments from work with there. And those are some of the strengths I see in the process. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Peter, for that. Really, really useful. We have got about 15 minutes or so for questions. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. It's a very tricky subject. So if anyone has got any questions, because there are quite a lot of us online, if you look at the participant list, you'll see there's a little option to raise your hand. If you do that, then we know that you've got a question and you can ask that to either Harpreet or to Peter. I was hoping somebody from the EAUC might be online to talk about that, but if anyone else has got any comments or questions, yeah, just let us know. It's a very, very tricky subject. Kate Murray from Edinburgh, are you, have you got a microphone?
Helen Baker from University of West England also had some comments as well.
Okay, she might have sent those to you directly.
Okay.
Start with Kate Murray. Kate has asked, can you recommend a couple of key actions affiliates could take to support the work of Electronics Watch?
So I can start, and Peter, maybe you can add bits from your perspective. So I guess the very first question is, have the Electronics Watch contract terms been incorporated? Sometimes it's not a really substantive question because perhaps the highest degree of purchasing you're doing is through a framework agreement that has already incorporated the Electronics Watch contract terms, for which are then operationalized specifically for Electronics Watch affiliates. But that would be an initial question. And often affiliates choose to incorporate those contract terms in their kind of highest spend areas, and it might take a period of years before a contract is up for renewal to be able to do that. But often that is a question that's important, although, as I say, perhaps not necessarily in the higher education sector, where so many crucial framework agreements already incorporate the contract terms. And then it's about engagement. And as Peter said, Electronics Watch contract terms require a lot from suppliers in terms of transparency, monitoring reports, and some brands and suppliers are better at responding with that information than others, and it does require a bit of engagement. Electronics Watch both allows affiliates to do that engagement themselves, or designate a staff person within Electronics Watch to do that engagement for them. But then once you've got that information, the question is, how are you going to analyze it? Do you have the kind of expertise to compare what a brand says is an issue through their auditing and monitoring versus what workers are saying about a high risk area? And that's where the analysis from Electronics Watch, providing that kind of the information that you do get through supplier engagement to Electronics Watch to do that risk assessment, is really crucial. Following that risk assessment, Electronics Watch may say, look, here are the types of issues that we're seeing in the supply chain. This is the type of engagement we would like. And again, can raise those issues with the suppliers or the brands directly, but often it helps when affiliates are also saying, can you please respond to Electronics Watch in relation to the questions that they've asked of you? I'll stop there for now, but perhaps Peter might also have some just suggestions.
Yeah, I can just say at the last conference that the monitoring partners, as a kind of a single voice, said, you know, we would like the affiliates to engage more with this issue. You know, they're working really hard to produce this information. They're really working really hard to improve conditions, and they don't see, I mean, they said politely, but quite bluntly, that, you know, not enough affiliates are engaging in the topic. And I took that quite seriously. You know, with full disclosure, the university was a founding of Edinburgh, which I'm a part of, was a founding member of Electronics Watch, and we engaged very seriously with them. And, you know, but we haven't fully adopted the terms and conditions, the kind of most basic measure. We're trying to do that now, and that's kind of a complex process. But, you know, one of the simplest things that organizations could do is incorporate the terms and conditions and work towards those. The other is disseminating in a digestible form the information that Electronics Watch produces. You know, there's a wealth of information that they've produced. And so I think on the call is Marisol and Kate, who are leading the Higher Education Procurement Association subgroup on human rights. And one of the things we're discussing there is how to, you know, as most of the purchasing consortia are member affiliates, all the organizations that are members there are affiliates as well, and they're not, you know, we haven't had the resource or the coordination to disseminate the information to all those organizations. And that's one of the things that Marisol and Kate and others are looking at, saying, okay, what's the most efficient way to share this information with people, encourage them to mention Electronics Watch and this process to the brands. And because the more time it's mentioned, that's important. But it's the basic thing, and I thought was really refreshing. Barcelona Council had a presentation, and, you know, about how they were an affiliate of Electronics Watch for over a year, and they realized that they had just signed up and they hadn't really taken many concrete actions after a year. And they took a really honest look at that, and they said, okay, we'll start with two things. We'll start with adopting the terms, just simply doing that as simply as we can, and also sending prior information notices to our ICT market partners to let them know that we're taking this very seriously and that we're working with Electronics Watch. And those were simple measures, but they tried to keep it simple. And by keeping it simple, they've actually made a lot of progress, and we're able to present on that. So I think that's one thing that we need to think about. Now, we don't have really effective channels to work collaboratively, and that's the last thing I'll say. We have work in our own silos, and we have an incredible amount of things coming at us. you know, maybe this working remotely is a chance for us to take up a little bit more of that work. Right now, working together should save us effort, but honestly, it takes extra effort to join webinars, talk to people, and things like that. So I think once we get this started, a lot of people would be asking, okay, my purchasing consortia hasn't told me, you know, all the stuff that Electronics Watch is doing. And I think actually each of those purchasing consortia kind of lacks resources to do that. And that's something that we could do as, you know, we could do for once and then do for all the purchasing consortia. That's the kind of conversations I think we need to have. Was that too long?
No, we've got a couple of other questions that have come in. Sort of, you slightly covered some of this. Helen Baker from UE Bristol has asked, how do LUPC and organisations share information on electronic watch audits and findings back with universities as contract users? Harpreet, I think that's one for you.
Sure. So it would be great to have Marisol on this call, actually, because I think she would be best placed to respond to that question.
I can help you with that.
Great. Thank you. Great. Glad to have you here.
In terms of for us, for LUPC, we've been trying to promote Electronics Watch a lot in to let universities or institutions know that they can go direct with them. So it's not just telling them, okay, you are affiliate, but what can you do? And last year we had a specific day for kind of like responsible procurement, and there was 2 big sessions on Electronics Watch, including Mike Kilner, which is the IT senior category manager. So he was explaining how to use the terms and conditions, the contract clauses, and it was Peter as well from Electronics Watch explaining all the work that they do in a very more detail, including some of things that they don't show publicly, but because everyone in there was already LUPC Electronics Watch affiliate, they were able to show a bit of information. So I believe, so in our website, there is an email that you can use. I'm not sure who asked the question. Sorry, I forgot the name.
It was Helen Baker from UE Bristol.
All right. So yeah, Helen will, if University of Bristol is not with us, is with SUPC. So I believe.
So it's UE Bristol.
All right. So she will be able to ask to ask Electronics Watch for an email and a password to get access to everything direct, and all the information is on our website, to who email and everything. So she will be able, because I know there is a lot of reports that are confidential by Electronics Watch, so we cannot publish those sort of things. But if she's already affiliated, she can email and ask direct access.
We'll be sending through the information on how to get hold of Electronics Watch if you are interested in kind of hearing more. So that will be, it's in Harpreet's presentation. David Chapman, just because we'll get through maybe one more question, possibly 2. So David Chapman from the University of Warwick has asked, some universities are affiliated through SUPC. What is the difference between being an affiliate through SUPC and an affiliate directly?
Sure, I can answer that question. So most simply, the members of EAUC, LUPC and NWUPC are all directly affiliated to Electronics Watch through the membership option that those purchasing consortia have subscribed to. SUPC members are not, so that means essentially that SUPC as an independent company is affiliated to Electronics Watch, but their members are not. Individual members of SUPC have taken the decision to affiliate to Electronics Watch separately. That includes the University of Reading, where SUPC is based, as well as I think Sussex and potentially other universities, hopefully in the coming months. that we can confirm. But those universities have taken the decision that they want the kind of support that Peter's described, and hopefully I've been able to give you an overview of, and have affiliated to Electronics Watch separately. What SUPC's affiliation to Electronics Watch offers is being forwarded reports that Electronics Watch has published, the kind of risks of worker suicides, exposure to toxic chemical reports that Peter mentioned. But what it doesn't then offer is the kind of collaborative monitoring, worker-driven monitoring that is able to lead to the tangible improvements, because there's no way of knowing through our regional or thematic risk assessment reports whether those risks are linked to your specific supply chain. That added work is what is available to institutions that are members of the 3 purchasing consortia that I already named, LUPC, APUC and NWUPC, and not to other purchasing consortia unless individual members are directly affiliated to Electronics Watch.
One thing I'd say though, and perhaps Marisol or Kate could speak slightly more to this, is that, you know, one of the things that as a sector we're talking about doing, and Marisol is kind of leading on, is trying to get this information, the shareable information, to get more higher education institutions on the same page, regardless of whether they're affiliates, to engage more people with the shareable information and public information to encourage them to perhaps affiliate, but also to take advantage for current affiliates of the tools that are available. And, you know, which there's lots there that we could perhaps do more work to kind of relate to across the sector to make sure that, you know, we're not, again, as I said earlier, reinventing the wheel.
Great. Yeah, I think we all agree we need to be collaborating more. Helen Baker's made the point, we're not as a sector sharing what we know. It's not the best use of resources for everyone to pay to access the information when we're all purchasing from one sector contract, which is affiliated. So just so to slightly start to wrap this up, because we just have a minute left, we have been talking about doing another webinar on modern slavery later on in the year. We're going to link that into Modern Slavery Day, which is, you know, kind of run later in the year. Be interesting if we can get some of you back on that to for a bit of an update on whether, you know, this has been useful, whether it's been you've been able to kind of, you know, put some of this into practice, and then Harpreet and hopefully Peter will also be able to talk about anything that's changed over the kind of couple of months in between. Thank you.
Can I quickly, very quickly respond to Helen's point? So with SUPC, the Electronics Watch contract terms are included in key framework agreements, but they're only operationalized for affiliates, and that is because the work that I've described is incredibly risky for workers on the ground and requires a lot of safeguarding and, quite frankly, funds to be able to do. So it's only work that we can operationalize for the affiliates that have paid the affiliation fee to enable that work to take place. And so it's not a question about not wanting to share the information. It's about wanting a model of leaders in the sector that are kind of paying the affiliation cost that enables that worker-driven monitoring, which is not easy work to do. It's not a kind of checklist. It means being on the ground, having safe houses, having workers enabled and inspired and have the education to know when their rights are being violated so that they can come to those safe houses and provide information. And that's all very intensive work that requires an affiliation fee to be able to do and make happen. So yes, the SUPC contract framework agreements do include an Electronics Watch contract terms, but they're only operationalized for direct affiliates or affiliates of the 3 purchasing consortia that have affiliated on behalf of all their members.
Okay, sorry to jump in there again. We are a little bit over time. Again, if you wouldn't mind all please to just log into sli.do.com on your browsers literally a couple of seconds to just give us some feedback. Be really interested to know if there are any other topics that you would like to talk about, what you thought of the session today, anything else you'd like us to cover on this or on any other topics. That would be helpful. We've started to, just so that people have more opportunities to talk to each other face to face, we will start the EAUC sending out a weekly email on kind of what's coming up, what webinars, discussion groups we have for the week each Monday. So if you're subscribed to any of our mailing lists, you'll have that. Next week, we've got 2 webinars on Wednesday, engaging resistant stakeholders at 11 o'clock, followed by our Wednesday Wins, which we started yesterday, which is an informal chat on a Wednesday, 12:30 to 1:30, just so we can meet up, talk about anything and its dog, just so that we can just kind of have a chance to chat to people while we're all in our own homes. So that's really where we are. Thank you so much again to Harpreet and to Peter. Really appreciate your time and really look forward to kind of hearing what the developments are and hearing from all of you on what you're doing, how you've changed, and how we're really dealing with the modern slavery issue. So thank you all for coming, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.